Sinners and Secrets is a true crime and investigative commentary platform that operates under the principles of fair use as outlined in Section 107 of the U.S. Copyright Act. Our content may include copyrighted materials such as photographs, video clips, and audio excerpts for the purpose of criticism, commentary, news reporting, education, research, and discussion.
Picture this. It's April 25th, 1986. The small city of Pripyat nestles in the verdant Ukrainian countryside, home to nearly 50,000 souls. As midnight nears, families sleep soundly, unaware that for many, there will be no tomorrow. A young school teacher places the final period on her lesson plan before closing her notebook. Outside her window looms the crown jewel of Soviet nuclear achievement, the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. Its 4 massive cooling towers puncture the night sky like concrete monoliths. Tonight, reactor number 4 hums with activity, illuminated by fluorescent lights as engineers in white coats move with purpose across the control room. A senior engineer checks his watch. It's almost time. The safety test they've delayed twice already can't wait any longer. Management wants results. Reduce power to 700 megawatts, he says flatly. At that moment, no one knows that they've just set the clock ticking. I'm Sandy McKenna, and alongside my co-host, Abraham Ulrich, we're stepping outside our usual territory of murders and masterminds to explore a different kind of crime, one where the victims numbered not in the dozens, but in the thousands, where the crime scene wasn't a basement or an alleyway, but 1,000 square miles of contaminated earth, where the weapon wasn't a knife or a gun, but invisible radiation that continues to kill decades later. This isn't just a story about a nuclear meltdown. It's about arrogance, negligence, lies, cover-ups that reach the highest levels of government. And ultimately, it's about ordinary people who paid the price for extraordinary corruption. This is Sinners and Secrets.
Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle.
Before we dive into the events of Chernobyl, it's important to understand what exactly a nuclear reactor is and how it works, because without this context, the scale of the disaster can be hard to grasp. A nuclear reactor is essentially a device used to initiate and control a nuclear chain reaction which generates energy. This energy is harnessed to produce electricity. In a nuclear reactor, the process of nuclear fission occurs. This is where the nucleus of an atom is split into 2 smaller nuclei, releasing a tremendous amount of energy in the form of heat. Let's break this down. At the heart of most nuclear reactors, including the one at Chernobyl, is a fuel source, typically uranium or plutonium. These are heavy elements that are unstable, meaning their nuclei are prone to splitting apart when struck by a neutron. When a neutron strikes the nucleus of a uranium atom, the atom splits. This process is called nuclear fission. When it splits, it releases a large amount of energy in the form of heat, in addition to neutrons which then strike other uranium atoms, causing them to split in a chain reaction. This chain reaction, if left unchecked, could spiral out of control. That's why reactors are designed with such strict controls to prevent this from happening. In a nuclear reactor, this heat is used to produce steam. The reactor is surrounded by coolant, usually water, that absorbs this heat. The heat created is used to turn turbines which are connected to generators that produce electricity. In the case of the Chernobyl reactor, the coolant was water, but the reactor used graphite as a moderator, which slows down the neutrons, allowing them to cause more fission reaction. The control rods inside the reactor are crucial for managing the rate of the reaction. These rods are made of materials that absorb neutrons, such as boron or cadmium. By inserting or withdrawing these rods into the reactor, operators can slow down or speed up the reaction. Now you may be wondering, what happens when the reactor goes into overdrive? If the reaction gets too intense, the reactor will begin to overheat, and that's when things become dangerous. When this happens, the coolant can boil away, and without a cooling system to keep the core at a manageable temperature, the reactor can fail, potentially leading to an explosion or a meltdown. In short, a nuclear reactor is an incredibly powerful machine, but without the proper safety mechanisms, it's like a car without brakes. It can go from controlled energy production to a catastrophic disaster in the blink of an eye. Sadly, this is what we will soon learn.
Now that we've covered how a nuclear reactor works, let's zoom in on the mission that was underway the night that everything went wrong at Chernobyl. On paper, it was a routine safety test, a simulation meant to prepare for the worst-case scenario, a power outage. The mission? To determine whether the power generated by the inertia of the spinning turbines could provide just enough electricity to bridge a critical 30-second gap, the time it would take for the backup diesel generators to power on during a total loss of external electricity. The goal was simple but vital. On the surface, it sounds like a smart precaution. Nuclear reactors rely on constant cooling to keep the radioactive cores stable. If the power is suddenly lost, say, due to a storm or a burst pipe, and cooling stops, heat builds fast, and disaster can follow. So the test was supposed to help prevent that. But here's where things start to unravel. The test was rushed, corners were cut, and safety protocols were ignored. Initially, the test was assigned to the day shift crew, but at the last minute, power demand elsewhere in the region forced a delay. And by the time it finally happened, it was the middle of the night, and the test had been handed off to the night shift, a team that was younger and not fully equipped to handle an emergency safety test. Given the complexity of the reactor, there was too much technology to consider for any one person to handle. Skilled, yes, but prepared for what was coming? Not even close. And worse still, they had no idea about the fatal design flaws lurking inside the very reactor they were operating. The RBMK reactor was dangerously unstable at low power, with a critical flaw that would soon become tragically obvious. Internal documents warning of hazardous behavior in certain conditions had been circulated to RBMK facilities. So why wasn't this information acted on? Why didn't those in charge sound the alarm? Whether it was bureaucratic negligence or protection of the design bureau's reputation, the silence was deadly and unforgivable. Even the operators didn't know their own reactor could turn on them. The plan was to bring Reactor 4 down to about 1% of its full power, low enough to trigger the backup systems without causing a surge. But to run the test, engineers had to disable several safety systems. That included critical fail-safes like the system of emergency cooldown, which is designed to regulate temperature and prevent overheating. Some of the crew expressed concern, but there was one man who pushed forward, Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer. Dyatlov was an incredibly intelligent man, an experienced engineer known for being rigid, forceful, and a firm believer in following orders without question. When others hesitated, he insisted. And so, under Dyatlov's command, the test continued, despite mounting warnings, despite unstable conditions. The reactor had been operating at a dangerously low power level for too long. Its core was already unstable, and then things got worse. The power dropped even lower than planned, too low to maintain control. The reactor became unpredictable, dangerous. But still, Dyatlov refused to halt the test. Operators were under strict orders: do not shut down the reactor until the test is complete. And so, the team pressed on, knowing something felt wrong but too afraid to defy orders. At 1:23 a.m., the final sequence of the test began. Suddenly, a power surge. The operators grew concerned, and once realizing the sudden and rapid surge in energy, they hit the emergency shutdown button, AZ5, expecting it to kill the reaction instantly. In RBMK reactors, there are multiple AZ systems, each designed to reduce power by varying percentages. AZ-5 was the failsafe, the last resort meant to bring the reactor to a complete stop. What operators didn't fully understand was the system had a deadly flaw. RBMK reactors use control rods to regulate reactivity, but these rods had graphite tips. And while graphite eventually helps moderate the reaction, it initially increases reactivity. When the AZ-5 was activated, those graphite-tipped rods plunged into the core, and instead of calming the reactor, they caused a final, fatal spike in power. A shutdown meant to save the reactor ended up destroying it. Then, the unthinkable happened, a massive steam explosion. This explosion was local but devastating. It occurred within the still intact reactor enclosure. It caused a deformation in part of the active zone, which led to a massive spike in steam production. Moments later, a second, even more powerful explosion ripped through the building. This time, it wasn't just steam. Internal components of the reactor structure violently ruptured the core from within. The core itself, superheated, unstable, melting down. A 2,000-ton lid was blasted into the air like a manhole cover. Chunks of radioactive fuel and graphite erupted skyward, glowing with fire that couldn't be easily put out. In under a minute, Reactor 4 no longer existed, and the worst nuclear disaster the world had ever seen had just begun.
Inside the control room, chaos erupted. Operators were confused. Some even thought the explosion had only ruptured a water pipe. They had no idea that the core was exposed and that lethal radiation was already spreading. Firefighters were the first to respond, arriving without protective gear. They believed they were putting out an ordinary fire, unaware they were inhaling deadly radioactive particles. Some stood directly next to burning graphite from the reactor core, one of the most radioactive substances on Earth. Sadly, many of them would be dead within weeks. Ludmila Ignatenko, the wife of one of the first firefighters, has one of the most heartbreaking testimonies. She says, "I kept kissing his face, his hands, his body. He kept saying, 'Ludmila, don't sleep, talk to me.' I couldn't say no. I didn't know how much radiation he had absorbed. Nobody told me." Though there are many things in a power plant that can cause an explosion of this magnitude, Dyatlov, injured but still conscious, refused to believe the reactor had exploded. He insisted it was just a malfunctioning sensor or a hydrogen explosion. The devices designed to measure such extreme levels of radiation were now under rubble and debris, and despite the ones they did have maxing out, refusal to believe the core was exposed was prevalent among several of the engineers. Meanwhile, the Soviet leadership hesitated. First official reports downplay the explosion, and plant director Viktor Brukhanov refused to believe the worst, even as radiation levels maxed out the dosimeters, the device used to measure exposure. The government insisted that the situation was under control. Many officials genuinely believed the situation was less severe due to the limited information available. But outside, Reactor 4 was still burning, an open wound in the earth spewing radioactive smoke into the sky. The threat wasn't just to Pripyat. If left unchecked, the fallout could contaminate all of Europe. Realizing they could no longer contain or deny the scale of the disaster, the Soviet government mobilized quickly, assembling a high-level task force made up of senior party officials and dozens of top scientists. Two figures were sent to the front lines: Boris Shervina, a high-ranking Soviet official, and Valery Legasov, deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, one of the USSR's most respected nuclear physicists. Together, they were tasked with leading the disaster response, despite knowing the cost might be their lives. But how do you put out a fire that isn't just burning, but melting through concrete? At first, firefighters and emergency crew attempted to douse the flames with water, but this only made things worse. Water mixed with the molten core caused violent steam explosions, spreading more radioactive particles. Realizing their mistake, Legasov and his team ordered a different approach. Helicopters were deployed to drop thousands of tons of sand, boron, lead, and clay directly onto the burning reactor. The idea was to smother the flames and absorb the escaping radiation. For days, pilots flew over the exposed reactor, dumping load after load of materials, fully aware that each flight shortened their lives. Many of those pilots would later die from radiation sickness, and still, the danger was far from over.
Even though the core fire had been subdued, Vasily Nestorenko, one of the other task force scientists, realized they may be facing a terrifying new threat. Below Reactor 4, a hellish pool of molten nuclear fuel, graphite, and reactor debris was melting downward, like lava. If it reached the water reservoirs under the plant, it could trigger a steam explosion powerful enough to render half of Europe uninhabitable. Let that sink in. Half of Europe, entire cities, forests, farmlands, wiped out and poisoned for generations. There was only one solution. Drain the water fast. And only one way to do it: send men into the darkness to manually open the valves. 3 employees, Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bezpalov, and Boris Baranov, were sent in. These weren't soldiers trained for a suicide mission. They were engineers, men with families, men who likely knew they'd not make it home. Wearing nothing but thin rubber suits and carrying flashlights, they waded through radioactive water in pitch blackness, hunting for the right valves. One wrong step, one delay, that's all it would take. We've all been in pitch black rooms, that disoriented moment of panic. Now imagine that space filled with radioactive poison. Every splash against your leg could be your death sentence. Every breath could be your last. And still, miraculously, they made it. The valves were opened, the water drained, a second explosion was avoided. The world called them the Chernobyl divers. And though rumors claimed they died soon after, records show that at least 2 are still alive today. That moment floored me. In this dark, brutal story, it was a flicker of light, a reminder sometimes heroes live to be remembered. With the immediate danger contained, the Soviet Union launched one of the largest cleanup efforts in history. They mobilized more than 600,000 people, soldiers, scientists, and engineers. They were called liquidators. Their job? Stop the spread of radiation at any cost. Think about that. 600,000 people. That's more than the population of Miami. I mean, thrown into radioactive chaos. One of the most dangerous tasks were clearing debris off Reactor 3's roof. The explosion had scattered radioactive wreckage everywhere. Robots were sent in first, but the radiation fried their electronics in seconds. Just think about that for a second. The radiation was so intense, it killed machines. And when the machines failed, they sent in people. Enter the bio-robots, soldiers in lead-lined suits. Each one had just 90 seconds to dash onto the roof, shovel debris over the edge, and get out before hitting a lethal dose. And many did it multiple times. Most developed severe health issues and didn't live for much longer. One liquidator later said, "We knew it was suicide, but we went anyway. Some lasted a week, some a month. We weren't heroes. We were human shields." Though some liquidators were volunteers who knew the risks, for the Soviet Union, men were cheaper than machines. I've researched murderers who have had more conscience than the officials who sent these men to die. When a killer takes a life, we call it murder. But what do we call it when a government knowingly sends thousands to their deaths and calls it duty? But here's the cruel twist. Without their sacrifice, the fallout from Chernobyl would have lasted for generations. And that's the tragedy in this story's core. These men were heroes and victims, victims of the disaster and victims of the system that created it. And somewhere inside that horror is the true crime of Chernobyl.
For nearly 2 days, Soviet officials stayed silent inside the Soviet Union. People in Pripyat were still going about their daily lives, completely unaware they were being exposed to deadly levels of radiation. It wasn't satellite imagery or spies that first exposed Chernobyl. It was a Swedish plant worker just trying to clock in for his shift. But while the Kremlin could control its own people, it couldn't control nature. Hundreds of miles away at a nuclear power plant in Sweden, Workers arriving for their shift on April 28th triggered radiation alarms. At first, they thought there was a leak at their own facility until they realized the radiation was coming from outside. Swedish officials immediately launched an investigation. Wind patterns and radiation levels pointed in one direction, towards the Soviet Union. The same day, Swedish diplomats confronted Moscow, demanding an explanation. With mounting international pressure, the Soviet Union could no longer deny what had happened. At 9 p.m. on April 28th, nearly 3 days after the explosion, Soviet state television finally acknowledged that there had been an incident at Chernobyl. But even then, they downplayed the scale. They claimed the situation was under control. They didn't mention the death toll, the radiation levels, or the growing crisis. The world, however, was not convinced. By April 29th, Western intelligence agencies were already analyzing satellite images of Chernobyl. What they saw contradicted the Soviets' claim. A massive crater where Reactor 4 once stood, in smoke still pouring from the wreckage. International news outlets, including BBC, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, began reporting on a nuclear incident in the USSR. With the Soviet Union refusing to give details, speculations ran wild. Was this another 3 Mile Island? Was a meltdown still in progress? Meanwhile, panic spread across Europe. In Sweden and Finland, officials issued radiation warnings and began testing food and water supplies. In Germany and the UK, people were advised to stay indoors if rain was expected, fearing contaminated rainfall. In France and Italy, nuclear scientists were dispatched to measure radiation levels in the air, while newspapers questioned if Soviet nuclear reactor posed a global threat. In the United States, President Ronald Reagan was briefed on the situation, and American intelligence agencies began tracking radiation spread throughout Europe. In Greece and Bulgaria, farmers began destroying crops, fearing contamination. In Scandinavia, parents were warned to keep their children indoors. And still, the Soviet government remained silent. It wasn't until 36 hours after the explosion that Soviet officials ordered the evacuation of Pripyat. By then, radiation levels had already skyrocketed. Residents were told to pack only essential belongings. Buses lined the street as police officers reassured families that they would be able to return in a few days. The following is the official announcement that was broadcast to the residents on the day of the incident.
Внимание! 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 Уважаемые товарищи! Городской совет народных депутатов сообщает, что в связи с аварией на Чернобыльской атомной электростанции в городе Припяти складывается неблагоприятная радиационная обстановка. Партийными и советскими органами, воинскими частями принимаются необходимые меры. Однако, с целью обеспечения полной безопасности людей и в первую очередь детей возникает необходимость провести временную эвакуацию жителей города в пункты Киевской области. Для этого каждому жилому дому сегодня, 27 апреля, начиная с 14:00 часов, будут поданы автобусы в сопровождении работников милиции и представителей горисполкома. Рекомендуется с собой взять документы, крайне необходимые вещи, а также, на первый случай, продукты питания. Руководителями предприятий и учреждений определен круг работников, которые остаются на месте для обеспечения нормального функционирования города. Все жилые дома на период эвакуации будут охраняться работниками милиции. Товарищи, временно оставляя свое жилье, Не забудьте, пожалуйста, закрыть окна, выключить электрические и газовые приборы, перекрыть водопроводные краны. Просим соблюдать спокойствие, организованность и порядок при проведении временной эвакуации.
A Pripyat evacuee said, "They told us we'd be back in 3 days. I only took a handbag and a change of clothes. My entire life is in that apartment." Sadly, they never came back. The city was abandoned, frozen in time, with children's toys still left in playgrounds, food still on tables, and personal belongings scattered in now decayed apartments. But while Pripyat's people were escaping, the world was still in danger. The radioactive cloud had drifted over Belarus, Poland, Scandinavia, and even parts of Western Europe. Governments worldwide scrambled to analyze radiation levels and monitor the food and water supplies. In some areas, the authority advised people to stay indoors, fearing contamination.
While the world was piecing together what had happened, millions of Soviet citizens had no idea that one of the worst nuclear disasters in history had just unfolded in their own country. At first, the Kremlin controlled the narrative. The only official statement came from a brief, vague news report aired on the Soviet Union's main television station on April 28th. An accident has occurred at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. Measures are being taken to eliminate the consequences. There is no cause for concern. That was it. No mention of radiation, no mention of deaths, nothing to suggest the scale of this catastrophe. But by this point, rumors were already spreading. Inside the Soviet Union, information was tightly controlled. But whispers of something terrible happening in the Ukraine began circulating through underground networks, foreign radio broadcasts, and letters from relatives. In Kiev, just 90 miles from Chernobyl, people started noticing something strange. For days, government officials said everything was fine. But then suddenly, on May 1st, thousands of high-ranking communist officials and their families quietly left the city. At the same time, radio waves carried a very different message. Western stations like the BBC, Voice of America, and Radio Free Europe began broadcasting about a massive nuclear accident in Ukraine. Despite Soviet jamming efforts, many citizens, especially intellectuals and dissidents, were able to pick up the foreign broadcasts. By the evening of May 1st, they knew this wasn't just an incident. It was, indeed, a catastrophe. In a shocking move, Soviet authorities went ahead with massive May Day celebrations across Ukraine, including a huge parade in Kiev on May 1st, just 5 days after the explosion. Thousands of families, including children, were encouraged to march in the streets, unaware that radiation was already spreading all over the city. It was a calculated move to prevent panic. The government wanted to maintain absolute control, even if it meant exposing people to danger. But by May 2nd, the Soviet lie was falling apart. They marched their children through invisible poison, all to keep up appearances. As days passed, radiation-related illnesses began to appear. In Kiev, children developed sudden nosebleeds. People felt sick for no reason, dizzy, weak, nauseous. Hospitals quickly filled with radiation poisoning cases, and still, the government refused to tell the public the full truth. Then, on May 5th, the Soviet Union made an announcement that stunned the country. Large sections of Ukraine and Belarus were being evacuated. Entire villages were ordered to leave immediately. It was the first time that many Soviet citizens realized the disaster was far worse than they had been told. By then, it was too late. Thousands had already been exposed.
From the moment Reactor 4 exploded, the Soviet Union wasn't just fighting a nuclear catastrophe, it was fighting to control the truth. And no organization was better at suppressing information than the KGB. The Committee for State Secrecy, or KGB, was the Soviet Union's most powerful intelligence agency. Their job? To make sure no one inside or outside the USSR learned the full scale of what happened at Chernobyl. In the days following the disaster, a large and tightly coordinated response unfolded. one that included not only emergency crews, government officials, and the Ministry of Healthcare, but also the KGB. Their involvement went far beyond security. Agents confiscated internal plant documents that revealed prior safety concerns about Reactor 4. They intercepted communications from Chernobyl officials who were attempting to warn others about the spread in radiation. Medical personnel were ordered to remain silent about the increasing number of radiation-related illnesses appearing in hospitals. And those plant workers who dared to speak out about the reactor's design flaws were met with threats and intimidation. But the cover-up didn't stop there. The KGB launched a full-scale operation to erase anything that might suggest Soviet nuclear technology was flawed. Records of previous safety violations at Chernobyl were classified or destroyed. Early radiation measurements, which showed extreme level of exposure, were altered to make them seem lower. Plant workers who had warned about the reactor's risks were either silenced or discredited. One example, scientist Vladimir Sherbak was one of the first to calculate that Reactor 4's radiation levels were far higher than the government was admitting. His reports disappeared. He was later told by KGB officers not to speak about his findings or face the consequences. As international media and foreign governments started asking questions, the KGB went on the offense. Western journalists in Moscow were monitored, followed, and given false information to discredit their reports. Foreign scientists studying radiation spread in Europe were dismissed as anti-Soviet propagandists. Swedish and American intelligence agencies were accused of exaggerating the crisis to make the Soviet Union look bad. Behind the scenes, Soviet diplomats were ordered to downplay the incident in conversation with foreign governments. They denied any large-scale contamination, even as radiation was spreading across Europe. By late 1986, the disaster could no longer be hidden. Satellite images, international reports, and radiation tracking had exposed the truth. But the KGB and Soviet leaders needed someone to blame. So, instead of admitting to design flaws or government failures, the USSR arrested several plant officials and put them on trial. Viktor Brukhanov, plant director, Alexander Kovalenko, head of the reactor department, Nikolai Fomin, chief engineer, Yuri Loshkin, inspector of the State Nuclear Regulation Authority, Anatoly Dyatlov, deputy chief engineer, and Boris Rogozhin, head of the power plant shift. They were sentenced to prison, not because they were fully responsible, but because the KGB needed an scapegoat to protect the higher-ranking officials. Meanwhile, top Soviet nuclear officials who had ignored safety concern about the RBMK reactors were never punished. In the wake of the Chernobyl disaster, one man stood out, not just for his courage, but for his commitment to revealing the truth. His name was Valery Legasov, a prominent nuclear physicist and one of the first to recognize the true scale of the catastrophe. In the aftermath of the explosion, the Soviet government assembled a task force of some of the nation's most brilliant and dedicated scientists. These men and women, many of whom had no choice but to walk into danger with limited information, became the backbone of the early disaster response. They assessed radiation levels, developed emergency protocols, and worked under immense pressure to contain a crisis the world had never seen before. Among them was Valery Legasov, a respected nuclear physicist and deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy. Legasov stood out not just for his expertise, but for his integrity. He was one of the first to arrive at the site and immediately join efforts on the ground, evaluating the damage, coordinating containment, and guiding the emergency crew through an unfolding nightmare. But more than that, Legasov became one of the first to speak out openly about the truth, that this was not just an accident, but the result of deep design flaws in the RBMK reactor and systematic failures in the Soviet nuclear program. But despite his expertise, Legasov faced immense opposition from Soviet authorities. The Soviet government, still trying to maintain its reputation and protect the nuclear program, downplayed the extent of the disaster. They denied the severity of the radiation, and the world was kept in the dark for several days about the true scale of the crisis. Legasov, however, could not ignore what he saw. He spoke publicly about the flaws in the reactor's design and the unavoidable consequences of such an explosion. In the immense aftermath, Legasov became a whistleblower of sorts. He recorded confidential tapes detailing his findings in the inadequacies of Soviet nuclear technology. In those tapes, he discussed the flawed reactor's design and the Soviet government's refusal to acknowledge the true cause of the explosion. Despite his dedication and bravery, Legasov became a target of Soviet officials. His outspoken criticism of the system led to growing tensions with authorities, and soon after Chernobyl, he was sidelined. The government began to distance itself from him despite being a key figure in the response to the disaster. He was removed from his position and prevented from continuing his work on nuclear safety. The official Soviet narrative needed to remain intact. The government could not afford to acknowledge the extent of their mistake, so they silenced the one man who was brave enough to tell the truth. By 1988, 2 years after the disaster, Legasov's health began to deteriorate. In a final act of protest, he chose to take his own life on April 27, 1988, exactly 2 years after the Chernobyl explosion. His death was ruled a suicide, though many believe that the immense weight of what he knew and the isolation he felt played a key role in his tragic end. In the years following Legasov's death, the truth began to slowly leak out. His tape recordings were made public and the world learned the extent of the reactor flaws in the government's reckless cover-up. Though Legasov's life ended in tragedy, his courage in speaking out in the face of a system that sought to suppress the truth cemented his place as a hero. He is now remembered not only for his expertise, but for his moral courage. His legacy is a reminder of the power of truth, especially when the system tries to conceal it. While history often remembers a few, the Chernobyl response was a collective act of scientific courage, and many deserve recognition alongside Legasov. Legasov was posthumously awarded recognition for his work and is now remembered as the man who tried to save the world from the deadly consequences of silence. Legasov's story isn't just about a brilliant scientist. It's a tale of one man's unwavering commitment to truth, even when it cost him everything. In a world where power often silences dissent, Legasov's courage in speaking out about Chernobyl serves as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, the truth demands to be heard.
When the explosion first occurred, Boris Sherbina was sent to Chernobyl with one mission: make sure it didn't get any worse. He was a man of action, known for his loyalty to the Communist Party, for his ability to carry out orders, but Chernobyl would prove to be beyond his control. Boris Sherbina was on the front lines of the initial crisis, coordinating with scientists and engineers to figure out how to stop the radiation from leaking further. He was there when the liquidators, the brave men sent in to clean up the radioactive debris, worked under harrowing conditions. Despite the risks, Sherbina maintained a strong, calm public front. He delivered speeches assuring the Soviet people that everything was under control, even though, behind the scenes, it was far from it. By the time the disaster was contained, the true extent of the disaster had become impossible to hide. The KGB and other high-ranking officials quickly turned their focus to blame, and Sherbina, despite his efforts, was not immune from scrutiny. Though he was never charged with criminal negligence, despite his direct involvement with the initial response, he was removed from his position overseeing the Chernobyl cleanup in 1987. Just a year after the explosion, the government needed to shift focus away from the fallout of the disaster and move forward with their narrative of Soviet resilience. After being dismissed from his role at Chernobyl, Sherbina went on to serve in other government roles and maintained his loyalty to the Soviet system. He even received several accolades and awards for his efforts, but the stigma of Chernobyl never fully left him. In 1989, he was appointed as the head of the Ministry of Heavy and Transport Engineering, a position in which he was tasked with overseeing industrial projects across the Soviet Union. However, his public profile was diminished in the wake of the Chernobyl disaster. He died in 1990 from cancer, just a year before the Soviet Union collapsed. While his death was never directly linked to the fallout from Chernobyl, it is a grim reminder that the disaster cast a shadow over everyone involved. Boris Sherbina's legacy is complicated. While he did play a central role in managing the immediate aftermath of the Chernobyl explosion, the consequences of his actions, or in some cases his lack of action, have led to a mixed public perception. On one hand, he worked tirelessly to limit the damage during the crisis, often putting his life at risk to coordinate the response. On the other hand, he was part of the Soviet leadership that refused to fully disclose the extent of the catastrophe, which only exacerbated the disaster's long-term health and environmental impacts. Today, he is remembered as one of the many figures who tried to control the narrative of Chernobyl, but his efforts to contain the disaster were not enough to escape the consequences of the tragedy. His role stands as a symbol of the Soviet Union's failure to recognize the scale of the crisis and the dangerous loyalty that often put the state's image above human life. Boris Sherbina's life after Chernobyl is a tragic reflection of the Soviet system's ability to come to terms with its own failings. He spent the rest of his life trying to balance loyalty to a government that had abandoned its people and managing the aftermath of a disaster that could never be erased. His story reminds us of the human cost of bureaucracy, secrecy, and state power, and how in the end the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how we try to suppress it.
The true human cost of Chernobyl will never be fully known. The official Soviet death toll was just 31 people, a number that even Soviet officials knew was a lie. In reality, the effect of radiation exposure didn't happen at once. In the weeks, months, and years that followed, thousands of people began developing cancers, radiation sickness, and other deadly illnesses. The first responders, firefighters, plant workers, and cleanup crews were among the hardest hit. Many of them died slowly and painfully from acute radiation syndrome. Children exposed to radiation developed high rates of thyroid cancer. Entire families in Ukraine and Belarus suffered birth defects, immune disorders, and long-term mental health problems. Even today, scientists estimate that tens of thousands of people may have died from Chernobyl-related illnesses. Pripyat, once a thriving city of over 50,000 people, is now a frozen time capsule. When the evacuation happened, people were told they would return in a few days, but they never came back. Most homes were abandoned. A Ferris wheel built for the May Day celebrations never spun with passengers. Schools remained filled with Soviet propaganda posters, abandoned notebooks, and gas masks. Pripyat became one of the most haunting reminders of the disaster, a city abandoned overnight, left to rot under a cloud of radiation. Even today, it remains one of the most radioactive places on Earth. After the evacuation, the Soviet government created the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, a 1,000 square mile area where radiation levels were considered too dangerous for human life. Entire villages were bulldozed to the ground. Ironically, today, the exclusion zone is one of the most untouched wildlife sanctuaries in Europe. Without human interference, wolves, bears, and even rare species like lynxes have repopulated the area. But for humans, it remains a wasteland. For decades, the Soviet Union had thrived on secrecy and controlled information through propaganda and censorship, but Chernobyl was too big to hide. The world saw the USSR's failures. Soviet citizens realized their government had lied to them. Calls for transparency and reform spread across the country. Mikhail Gorbachev later admitted that Chernobyl was a turning point for the Soviet Union. Some historians believe that Chernobyl helped accelerate the collapse of the USSR, because once the truth was exposed, there was no going back. Gorbachev later admitted that Chernobyl was one of the main reasons the Soviet Union collapsed. Just 5 years after the explosion, the Soviet Union fell. Chernobyl wasn't just a nuclear disaster, it was a turning point in human history.
The Chernobyl disaster didn't just leave a scar on the Soviet Union. It left an indelible mark on Earth itself. For months after the explosion, radioactive fallout spread across large parts of Europe. While the immediate impact on human life was devastating, the environmental consequences were equally as catastrophic. The Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, a 30-kilometer radius around the reactor, was created to prevent human exposure to the lethal radiation still contaminating the land. But the zone was just the beginning. The contamination spread far beyond, affecting forests, rivers, and wildlife in unexpected ways. The most famous environmental consequence of Chernobyl is known as the Red Forest, located near the plant. The Red Forest earned its name because shortly after the explosion, the trees surrounding the area turned bright red and began to die off, poisoned by the radioactive particles that had fallen from the sky. It became one of the most contaminated areas in the world. However, what's truly fascinating is what happened after the forest died. While humans were forced to flee, wildlife began to return. The absence of humans allowed the forest to regenerate, though still tainted by radiation. Animals such as wolves, boars, deer, and even bears have been spotted in the area, thriving in a land that most of the world would consider uninhabitable. But this is a double-edged sword. While nature in the Chernobyl exclusion zone has flourished in the absence of human interference, the impact of radiation is undeniable. Many animals have suffered morphological abnormalities, particularly in the first generation exposed to the fallout. Some showed physical deformities, reduced fertility, and shortened lifespans, visible scars of an invisible threat. Nature may be reclaiming the land, but it too had a price to pay. Even now, almost 40 years later, radiation levels in the Chernobyl exclusion zone remain dangerously high. The radioactive isotopes that were released during the explosion have long half-lives, meaning they will remain harmful for thousands of years. The original sarcophagus built around Reactor 4 to contain the radiation was beginning to fail by the early 2000s. Fearing further leaks, an international effort was launched to construct a new steel structure to encase the reactor. In 2016, the new safe confinement was completed, a massive, futuristic structure designed to encase the reactor and prevent the further spread of radiation. This colossal structure was the result of a global collaboration and a symbol of how much Chernobyl has cost the world in both money and lives. In the aftermath of Chernobyl, the global attitude towards nuclear energy shifted dramatically. Before the disaster, many countries were investing heavily in nuclear power as a clean, efficient energy source. But Chernobyl shattered that belief. The disaster had devastating effects on the nuclear industry. Countries across Europe and even in the U.S. began to reassess the safety of nuclear plants. In some cases, entire nuclear programs were scrapped. Germany, for example, decided to phase out its nuclear energy program entirely, with plans to shut down all reactors by 2022. Sweden also curtailed its nuclear expansion and imposed stricter safety regulations on existing plants. France, which had been one of the most pro-nuclear nations, experienced public protests and calls for more rigorous safety standards. But despite the fears, nuclear energy did not disappear. In fact, many countries, especially in Asia, continued to build new reactors and improve safety measures. In places like China and India, nuclear power was still seen as a necessary solution to meet growing demand for energy and reduce reliance on fossil fuels. There's also a substantial difference in the technology of the plants that had major accidents and the ones that are built now.
Chernobyl's shadow continues to loom over the collective consciousness. It's more than just a historical event. It has become part of global culture. The world is still grappling with the effects of the disaster, from books like Voices from Chernobyl by Svetlana Alexievich to documentaries and television series like the HBO miniseries Chernobyl. The disaster, it's revisited regularly in media and pop culture. The reason for this enduring interest is simple. Chernobyl represents humanity's worst fears about technology, government secrecy, and the frailty of life. But it's also a story about resilience, how people struggled, how communities rebuild, and how nature slowly began to reclaim its territory. And as we look back on Chernobyl, we are reminded of the powerful lessons it offers. The risk of unchecked power, the cost of secrecy, the complexity of progress, and the importance of responsibility in shaping our future. Chernobyl wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning that echoes through history, and one we must never forget. The scars of Chernobyl will remain long after we are gone. And as we face new challenges, whether in nuclear energy, climate change, or other global crises, we must remember the lessons that Chernobyl teaches us. The battle to control the radiation is still ongoing, and it will be for generations to come. Chernobyl was a lesson paid for in human lives, lives that left a haunting truth. When governments put power above people, the consequences can be catastrophic, and Chernobyl is proof that some mistakes last forever. I am Abraham Alric, and along with Sandy McKenna, we want to thank you for joining us on this episode of the Chernobyl disaster. As always, we encourage you to take the lessons from these events and apply them to our current world. If you found this episode informative, please subscribe, like, and share. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to life. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and may your journey be as rich and enlightening as the stories you encounter. We'd like to extend our deepest thanks to Alexander from Ukraine, whose incredible footage and deep knowledge of Chernobyl helped bring this story to life. His first-hand perspective added a level of authenticity and depth we couldn't have captured otherwise. You can find more of his work on Chernobyl in his YouTube channel, Chernobyl Family. We highly recommend it. Link to his channel in the description below.